So the book of Esther starts out with King Xerxes. He's extremely wealthy. He throws a banquet, and not only is it a banquet, it lasts for 7 full days. And so he's showing off the wealth that he and his kingdom have. Sometime after the banquet or at the end of the banquet, he asks for Queen Vashti to appear before the king. She refuses to do so. You may remember he got all his advisors together and said, well, you better do something about this because the other wives are going to start doing the same thing to the other husbands. So they determined that Vashti would no longer be queen. During this time, Mordecai is raising his cousin Esther, and they're looking for candidates to become queen. Charles, were you the last couple folks that came in? Thank you. So among the candidates to be queen is Esther, and she goes through 12 months of beauty treatments. They parade all the potential candidates for queen in front of King Xerxes, and Esther is selected, and as a result of her being selected, a banquet to celebrate is given. So this is the second banquet that's been listed in the book of Esther. Shortly after Esther becomes queen, her cousin Mordecai at the gates uncovers a plot to kill King Xerxes. So he goes through Esther to get the information to the king. The king becomes aware of it, and the 2 people that were plotting against him, Bigthana and Teresh, both of them wind up being put to death.
Hey Chuck,
Uh-huh.
did they ever figure out why they were wanting to kill the king?
Yeah, they wanted to, it's sort of like an insurrection or try to overthrow. It was very common for folks to try to overthrow the powers, even within the same families. So there was times when, in order to become king during that time in the different empires, that sometimes people would kill 10 or 20, 70 of their family members, so there'd be no more competition for them to be king. Meanwhile, Haman is promoted in the king's favor, and we know that Haman's ancestry is through the Amalekites. So Haman is promoted, and he becomes the number two person in the kingdom to King Xerxes. One of the things that Haman wants is, as he's walking through town or going through town on his horse, he's expecting all the citizens to bow down before him, and Haman or Mordecai refuses to kneel down to Haman. This makes Haman mad. He knows that Mordecai is a Jew, so he decides to kill all the Jews. So there's two motives here for Haman. One is the Amalekites have a long history of hating the Jews, and then secondly, Mordecai is sort of showing them up by not bowing down before him. So Haman decides to kill the Jews. He needs to determine what day the Jews are going to be annihilated. So he casts lots. He throws the dice. He throws the stones. Whatever he used to. Yeah, that's all I've got. Maybe you and Teresa could share, Charles. Mm-hmm. They cast lots, and it's determined that the day that the Jews are going to be annihilated is going to be the 13th day of the month of Adar. And you may remember we talked about how the Jews were on a lunar calendar. There was 29 and a half days in the month. And so in our solar calendar that we run today, the date for the 13th day of Adar will change, just like Easter changes, just like the Passover changes. And it falls somewhere in the month of February or March. So Haman gets the king to agree to kill the Jews without actually saying it's the Jews. He tells him there's these people that are not obeying his laws, and without actually saying it's the Jews, he gets the king to agree. Word gets out, a decree is given, it's read among all the different provinces. There's 127 provinces in Persia at the time, and Mordecai persuades Esther to try to help. All the Jews are fasting, they're weeping in sackcloth and ashes. It's a little bit of pressure on Esther. She's still a fairly young woman, may still be in her teens. She's not sure how to approach King Xerxes, and she decides to help. And her last words as she's making this decision to Mordecai is, "If I perish, I perish." So Esther's got to figure out how to get before the king. Even though she was queen, she didn't necessarily see the king every single day. So she dresses up and she's in the outer courtyard, and Xerxes looks out and he sees Esther, and she's gotten his attention. So the king asks, "What do you want?" And she says, "Well, I'd like to have a banquet for Haman. I'd like for the attendees to be myself, Queen Esther, you, King Xerxes, and Haman. And this will be the third banquet then that we've had so far in the book of Esther." So they have the banquet. The king says, "Hey, what do you want?" And Esther's pretty sly, and she says, "Well, what I'd really like is to have another banquet tomorrow." So she requests a second banquet for the next day. The king agrees, and things just keep going on between Haman and Mordecai. He refers to Mordecai as that Jew, Mordecai, emphasis on that and Jew, and he becomes more and more upset with Mordecai. So he goes belly aching to his wife and friends, says, "What should I do?" And they suggest to Haman that he build a 75-foot gallows, which we know in Persia, rather than something that you hang someone on, it's a pole that they're going to impale someone on. So they build this 75-foot pole in order to ultimately impale Mordecai on it. So at this point in the book of Esther, we're about halfway through the book of Esther. Things look pretty bleak for the Jews, and things look pretty bleak for Mordecai. However, at this point in the book, it starts to become the turning point. It's the start, it's the beginning of the turning point in the book. So Xerxes, shortly after this, has a night where he can't sleep. He calls in some of his servants and has the history books or the chronicles read to him. And one of the things that read is the story of Mordecai alerting the king of the potential assassination attempt that happened 5 years ago. So Xerxes decides that he wants to honor Mordecai somehow. So he's contemplating how to honor Mordecai. He notices that Haman is out in the outer court, and Haman is out there waiting to get the king's attention to ask him if he can assassinate or he can execute Mordecai on the pole that he's just constructed. So Xerxes has Haman come in, and he tells Haman, without telling him who, he tells Haman, "I really want to honor somebody. If I wanted to honor somebody, what would I do?" And we know the story. He says, "Put on a royal robe, put him on the royal horse, parade him through the city. If the king really wants to honor somebody, that's the way to do it." And of course, Haman's pretty conceited, and he's thinking that the honor is going to be for him. So he's basically telling the king, this is how I would like to be honored. So the king says, I think that's a great idea, Haman. I want you to do that for Mordecai. So the turn of events, Haman had been in there to try to get permission from the king to execute Mordecai, and just the opposite happens. He's now told to dress Mordecai up, put Mordecai on the horse, and you lead Mordecai through the city. Later that evening, after Mordecai had been honored in the city, Esther's second banquet includes the king and Haman again, and of course this is the fourth banquet so far in the book of Esther. So in the book it says, after they had been drinking for a while, the king says to Esther, so what is your petition? What is your request? And she says, my petition is to grant my life and to spare my people. My people have been sold for destruction, slaughter, and annihilation. And she uses those specific words because the decree that Haman had sent out and sealed with the king's signet ring had those exact words in it. So Haman's sitting here, he hears those words. The thoughts got to be running through Haman's mind. So the king says, who is this person? Who is he? Who would dare to take my queen's life and kill her people? And her response was, this vile Haman. So just as he said, that Jew Mordecai, now Esther says, this vile Haman. So we know then that the king ultimately has Haman impaled on the pole that he built to execute Mordecai. The king gives Esther Haman's estate. The signet ring goes from Haman to Mordecai, and Esther puts Mordecai in charge of Haman's former estate. So now Esther asks Xerxes for another order to be written to overrule Haman's plans to destroy the Jews. So remember a few months earlier, the edict had gone out. They had picked the 13th day of Adar for the Jews to be annihilated by their fellow citizens there in Persia. You may remember we studied that no document in the king's name and sealed with the king's ring can be revoked. So they can't revoke it. They got to come up with some way to counter that decree. So the second decree, Mordecai works on it, and it's sent out with the king's seal again with the signet ring, that the Jews now have the right to assemble and protect themselves. So on the 13th day of Adar, when the enemies are going to try to overtake the Jews and kill, destroy, and annihilate the Jews now have the right due to this decree to protect themselves. And it says the Jews can destroy, kill, and annihilate, same words, anyone who might attack them. And it also says that the Jews have the right to plunder the property of the enemies. After class last week, I had someone come up and ask me what plunder was. What's plunder?
It's spoils of war.
Spoils of war, possessions, goods. It could be animals, it could be gold, it could be silver. But in the decree, they have the right then for those that wanted to do harm to the Jews after they killed them, they could take the plunder. So on the 13th day of Adar, the day that came up as you cast the stones, in Hebrew it's called Pur, P-U-R. They cast the stones, the Pur, and the date had been the 13th day of Adar. The Jews defended themselves from those seeking their destruction. On the 13th day of Adar, in the citadel of Susa, so the high point may have been a fort, We talked last week, there may or may not have been soldiers there. The Jews destroyed, slaughtered, and annihilated 500 men, including the 10 sons of Haman. But even though they had the right to do so, they did not plunder. And that's going to be important as we continue in the story. So on the next page, in the other providences, the Jews also destroyed and slaughtered and annihilated 75,000 more people. So within the citadel, within the city of Susa, it was it 500? It was 500. And then in the balance of the provinces, there was 127 provinces in Persia at the time. Another 75,000 were killed. And again, in all the other provinces, the Jews did not plunder. So,
Was there something that went out? I mean, the decree did not state for them, said they had the right to plunder or could plunder, but was there just something among them that said, no, we're not going to? Or, I mean...
Yeah, absolutely, and give us 2 minutes or 3 minutes and we'll get to that. You're the setup man, and I appreciate it. Okay? So Esther goes to the king and requests that in the city of Susa, so not the citadel, not the high point, but in the city of Susa, let the Jews continue for a second day, continue on to the 14th. And she also asked the 10 sons of Haman that had been killed during the citadel on the 13th, she wanted their bodies displayed up on the pole, have them impaled and displayed up on the pole. And we talked last week, I'm not sure they had time to build 9 more poles, so I don't know if they were on there like shish kebab, or whether they put up 9 more poles and they were all sort of horizontal to each other. But nonetheless, the king gives the okay, and on the 14th day of Adar, so the day after, the Jews destroyed, slaughtered, and annihilated another 300 in the city of Susa. In addition to that, on the 14th, the 10 sons of Haman were impaled, and they did not plunder. Then on the 14th day of Adar, in the other provinces, so outside of Susa, the Jews rested and made it a day of feasting and joy. So they did the annihilation on the 13th, 75,000 people. And then on the next day, they rested and made a day of feasting and joy. And then on the 15th day of Adar, in the city of Susa, the Jews rested and made it a day of feasting and joy. And theirs was postponed by another day because they had the second day in which they killed those in the city. So to get to Charles's question, when the Jews annihilated the folks in Persia that were their enemies, at a minimum, they killed the Amalekites. Again, Persia had this big empire. There were people from different backgrounds, different nationalities that were in this empire. Jews were certainly one. Amalekites were a second. Now, there may have been other folks that wanted to do harm to the Jews in addition to the Amalekites, but at a minimum, the Amalekites were among those that the Jews destroyed, slaughtered, and annihilated. So this ends an over 1,000-year conflict between the Israelites and the Amalekites. So when the children of Israel were leaving Egypt, you remember the story of getting water from the rock? The next thing listed in the book of Exodus after the water came from the rock was the Amalekites ambushing and attacking Israel. And you can find that in Exodus 17:8. So there's this long hatred between the Jews and the Amalekites. And we talked last week how God sort of had the Amalekites in his craw, and we're going to see examples of that. So as soon as the Israelites had shortly been out of Egypt, the Amalekites attack Israel. In Exodus chapter 17, verse 14, God tells Moses, I want the Amalekites blotted out. I don't want there to even be a remembrance that they were on this earth. I want them completely blotted out. And Moses, make sure Joshua hears it. So Joshua was the general at the time for the Israelites, and eventually will take over for Moses. And God goes out of his way to tell Moses, make sure Joshua hears it. In Deuteronomy chapter 25, the majority of Deuteronomy is God relaying his laws for the children of Israel. There were dietary laws, there were civil laws, and then there were the religious laws. He's laying out these laws, listing them one after another. Right in the middle of relating those laws to Moses, God says to Moses, I want those Amalekites blotted out. So he's listing all these laws, and it's almost like it's stuck in his craw, where it comes to mind. He says, and by the way, I still want the Amalekites blotted out. I don't want there to even be a single one left. And he says, do not forget. If you go to Deuteronomy 25, 17 through 19, after making those statements to Moses, he literally says, do not forget. And at least in the NIV, at the end of do not forget, there's an exclamation point. So, about 300 years later, after that, after the Amalekites ambushed and attacked the Jews, about 300 years later, the time's come to blot out the Amalekites. So God gets a hold of Samuel and tells Samuel to go to King Saul and tell King Saul he wants those wicked people. He wants the Amalekites. He wants those wicked people destroyed. He wants them killed. He wants them totally destroyed, and do not spare them. No plunder. He wants everything destroyed. So Saul goes to war against the Amalekites. However, he spares the king, and he sees plunder. He took their best cattle, took their best sheep. He did not do what God wanted. God wanted them blotted out. He wanted them no plunder. The Jews know the story. The Jews know their history. The Jews know that King Saul lost his kingship because he spared King Agag and he plundered. So even though the decree from the king or the decree from Mordecai said, when you take these folks on, you can plunder, the Jews knew that was the demise of King Saul because he did plunder. So 300 years after the Jews were attacked, the Israelites were attacked coming out of Egypt, Saul has his opportunity. Saul blows it. He spares the king. He sees plunder. God's so upset with King Saul that he takes the kingship away. So now it's another 700 years later after Saul during the book of Esther. So a total of 1,000 years since God wanted the Amalekites blotted out. 1,000 years later, 700 years after Saul, the Amalekites are finally destroyed, slaughtered, and annihilated, and the Jews did not plunder. Exactly what God wanted, and the Amalekites are blotted out. So there in about 15, 20 minutes is what we covered the first 12 weeks of class. So today, we're going to go to Esther Chapter 9, starting with verse 15. Let's see here. Could I get someone to read verses, verses 17, well, let's do verses 17 through 19. Someone willing to read chapter 9, verses 17 through 19?
I'll read it.
Okay.
This was done throughout the provinces on March 7th, and on March 8th they rested, celebrating their victory with the day of feasting and gladness. The Jews at Susa killed their enemies on March 7th. This is important. The Jews at Susa killed their enemies on March 7th, and again on March 8th and rested on March 9th, making that their day of feasting and gladness. Verse 19 starting, it says, so to this day, rural Jews living in remote villages celebrate an annual festival and holiday on the appointed day in late winter, when they rejoice and send gifts of food to each other.
Okay, thank you, Charles. So Charles's version that he read from is referencing the solar calendar, the calendar that we're used to right now. So we know on the 14th day of Adar, the Jews of the other provinces rested. That's in verse 17, and they made it a day of feasting and celebrating. Then in verse 18, on the 15th day of Adar, the Jews of Susa rested and made it a day of feasting and celebrating. Then in verse 19, on the 14th day of Adar, the rural Jews in villages made it a day of joy and feasting and giving presents to each other. So we've got this celebrating going on as a result of the Jews, number one, being able to defend themselves and they weren't blotted out, and then number two, they were able to destroy the Amalekites. So verses 20 through 23, please. Someone willing to read? Let's do 20 through 22, 20 through 22.
I'll get that.
Okay.
Mordecai recorded these events, and he sent letters to all the Jews throughout the provinces of King Xerxes, near and far, to have them celebrate annually the 14th and 15th days of the month of Adar, as the time when the Jews got relief from their enemies, and as the month when their sorrow was turned into joy, and their mourning into a day of celebration. He wrote them to observe these days.
Observe these days as days of feasting and joy and giving presents of food to one another and gifts to the poor.
Thank you.
Thank you, Jim.
Still no word.
So, the Jews automatically, the day after the victories, it would be normal to rest from fighting, but then to also throw some type of celebration. So they did it naturally. We're told then in verse 20 that Mordecai, again second in charge to King Xerxes, recorded these events, recorded what the Jews had done to celebrate. And he sends letters to all the Jews in all the provinces. So all the 127 provinces, he sends them this letter. And he says, hey, not only was it a good thing that we celebrated, but let's do this every single year. Let's make this a celebration every single year. Best of my knowledge, and someone may know differently, but this is a holiday that the Jews celebrate that was not instructed by God. So Passover, Jubilee, the Feasts of Harvest, all of those were dictated by God in either Leviticus or Deuteronomy. Those were holidays that God said, these are holy days. I want you to celebrate these. We mentioned last week, how many times is God mentioned in the book of Esther? 0. So this holiday isn't being given as a result of God commanding this to be done. But Xerxes sees the celebration that the Jews have, and he says, hey, let's make this an annual thing. So he sends this letter out to all the different provinces and says, as Jews, let's celebrate this every single year. Let's celebrate it on the 14th and the 15th. On the 14th, those that are rural, because you had ended your fight on the 13th, those that are in the city of Susa, and then eventually will become Jerusalem, let's celebrate on the 15th. And why are we going to do this annually? The Jews got relief from their enemies. The Amalekites were probably the number one enemy of the Jews. Sorrow turned to joy. We talked about how the beginning of the book of Esther versus the end of the book, at the beginning everything was bleak for Mordecai and the Jews. The second part of Esther, they were the ones that had the joy. Sorrow turned to joy, mourning into celebration. And the observance should be done with feasting, joy, giving presents of food, and gifts to the poor. So let's continue and take a look at verses 23 through 28. Anyone willing to read? Okay.
So the Jews undertook to do as they had begun, and as Mordecai had written to them. Because Haman, son of the Agag, the enemy of all Jews, had plotted against the Jews to destroy them, and had cast Pur, that is, the lot, to find a lucky day to crush and consume and destroy them. But when Esther brought the matter before the king, he commanded in writing that Haman's wicked scheme, which he had devised against the Jews, should return upon his own head, and that he and his sons should be hanged on the gallows. Therefore they called these days Purim, after the name Pur, meaning lot. Therefore, because of all that was in this letter, and what they had faced in this matter, and what had happened to them, the Jews ordained and took it upon themselves and their descendants, and all who joined them, without fail, every year they would keep these 2 days at the appointed time, and as it was written, that these days should be remembered, imprinted in their minds, and kept throughout every generation in every family, province, and city, and that these days of Purim should never cease from among the Jews, nor the commemoration of them cease among their descendants.
Okay, thank you, Teresa. So it says that the Jews took it upon themselves. Again, this wasn't a feast or a holiday dictated by the Lord. It was something that they initiated sort of naturally the day after battle. Mordecai had recorded it and sent it out, and the Jews agreed to celebrate during what Haman had written. And what do they celebrate? That Mordecai had written. And so what are they celebrating? Well, they're celebrating that Haman has been killed. He was the enemy of all Jews. He plotted against the Jews to destroy them. He cast the pur, or cast the lots, for their ruin and destruction. He issued the written orders, and as we know, the tables were turned and it came back on his own head, and not only his head, but his 10 sons as well. These days of celebration would be called Purim, which again is just an extrapolation of the word pur, which meant cast the lots. The Jews took it upon themselves to establish the custom. It was supposed to be for their descendants and all who joined them to observe these 2 days, every family, every city. It should never cease to be celebrated, and the memory should never die out among their descendants. So let's go to Esther 9, verses 29 through 32. Anyone? Bob, would you read for me 29 through 32?
So Queen Esther, daughter of Abihail, along with Mordecai the Jew, wrote with full authority to confirm the second letter concerning Purim. Mordecai sent letters to all the Jews in the 127 provinces of Xerxes' kingdom, words of goodwill and assurance, to establish these days of Purim at their designated times, which Mordecai the Jew and Queen Esther had decreed for them, and as they had established for themselves and their descendants in regard to their times of fasting and lamentation. Esther's decree confirmed these regulations about Purim, and it was written down in the records.
So thank you, Bob. After the Jews agreed, then they sent out a second set of letters and says, this is how it's going to be now. Everyone's agreed. We're going to continue to have this as a celebration every single year. It'll be words of goodwill and assurance. The days of Purim was then decreed throughout Persia. It would be for themselves and their descendants. There would be fasting and lamentation. So there will be, before the holiday, there'll be a period of fasting and sorrow and crying out, similar to the first part of the book of Esther. Esther herself had a period of fasting. And then, of course, we know the Jews had a period of fasting as well. The fasting and limitation is traditionally observed on the 13th day of Adar, so the day before the holiday, and it's referred to as the fast of Esther. So, what do you think? Do the Jews still celebrate it today? Anyone know? They absolutely do. And in fact, they say it's a cross between Halloween, Mardi Gras, and Easter. That it's some of the holidays that we celebrate all wrapped up into one. So I did a little research, and let me share with you what the Jews do today. So Purim, which is the Feast of Lots, is Adar the 14th today, except in Jerusalem, it's Adar the 15th, just like Susa during the Persian Empire was on the 15th, Jerusalem's on the 15th. This year, it's going to fall on Thursday, March 17th. So as we talked about earlier, because of the lunar calendar, it's going to be St. Patrick's Day this year. So it'll fall on Thursday, March 17th, the solar calendar versus the lunar calendar. The ritual observant begins with a day of fasting. It's referred to as the fast of Easter, and it's on Adar the 13th. This year in our calendar will be March the 16th, the day preceding the actual holiday. So then on the 14th, Jews will greet each other that day with Happy Purim, and that's their greeting as they see each other. They exchange gifts, sometimes as elaborate as our Christmas gift exchange. They make donations to at least 2 poor people, and one of the things that they do, and I'll cover it a little bit more later, is they'll traditionally dress up. So a minimum of a mask, and it may be an entire costume. And part of the reason there's masks is as you come in contact with the poor person that you wanted to give the gift to, the idea is not to embarrass the poor person. So the mask will cover up who's the person that's considered poor receiving that gift. The Purim feast is very festive. It includes wine or other intoxicating beverages. It's referred to as a day to let loose. In some celebrations, it says that they're even encouraged to get intoxicated. So I guess that's really letting loose. They make Purim baskets, so they'll make baskets with food in it, sort of like we make Easter baskets, and they will share the baskets of food. They make this pastry that has 3 corners to it. So there's 3 curved edges, sort of like a shamrock, to this pastry. And when they eat those, they say that they're eating Haman's ears. So part of the celebration that Haman was executed is eating Haman's ears. They dress up in costumes. I've mentioned the masks. They dress up in costumes when they go to school. In the synagogue, they're dressed up. And then in some cases, there'll actually be parades or carnivals. Just like we have Christmas carols, there's traditional Purim songs. So they will sing these Purim songs in celebration as well. In some cases, they have Purim plays. So they will dress up as all the characters in the book of Esther, and they will act out, they'll have a play depicting the book of Esther. If there's not a play, at a minimum, they'll read the entire book of Esther. And when reading the book of Esther, every time Haman's name is mentioned, and his name is in the book 54 times, whenever the word Haman is mentioned, they'll stamp their feet, they'll yell, they'll hiss, they'll be heckling. You know those things that you spin that make noise? Sometimes they come in with those ratchet noisemakers. And the intent is to blot out the name of Haman, just as God wanted the Amalekites blotted out. So our Vicki and I's financial planner is a Jew, and I guess it was earlier in the month of February, about a month ago, into January, early February. We had already started the book of Esther. As we know, Don and Anita were teaching the class then. And so we got together here in San Antonio. Before our review, we're having a meal together, and we were just sort of catching up. And I said, Larry, I said, Larry, what were your experiences with celebrating Purim? Have you done it? He goes, oh yeah, every practicing Jew celebrates Purim. He says it's a big celebration for us. It's a big deal. And I said, so what comes to mind? And he said, well, we dress up, and he says, and we love doing that ratchet thing when Haman's name is read. So we have at least one person that Vicki and I know that continues to celebrate Purim. In some areas, in addition to celebrating the destruction of Haman and the Amalekites, other things in their local area that took place on Purim, they will celebrate that as well. And I found two things that are very interesting. Joseph Stalin from, was it Russia then or USSR, the Soviet Union, he literally had bloody plans for what he referred to as dealing with the Jewish problem within their area of rule. So Joseph Stalin had bloody plans for dealing with the Jewish problem. He died on Purim in 1953. So Jews that are still in the former Soviet Union in Russia, part of their celebration, in addition to the demise of Haman and the Amalekites, is the demise of Stalin, literally dying on Purim in 1953. We remember in 1990, Saddam Hussein of Iraq invaded Kuwait. His army also fired Scud missiles into Israel at the exact same time. As we know, the U.S. led forces to take on Saddam Hussein in Iraq. We finally had all those hostilities end, and those hostilities ended on the Day of Purim at that particular time. So in areas where something significant happened on the Day of Purim, in addition to celebrating the demise of Haman and the Amalekites, they'll celebrate things that impacted them locally with the Feast of Purim. So to this day, the Jews celebrate Purim. And I found it sort of interesting on how they've taken a holiday that wasn't commanded by God, but still is part of their history and part of their national pride in celebrating Purim. Okay, so we have just 3 verses in chapter 10, and we'll be finishing the book of Esther. Any questions or comments on how the Jews celebrate today? Anyone have any questions or comments on that? Okay, well then let's finish up the book, Esther chapter 10. There's 3 verses there. Someone willing to read? Anybody? Okay, Jim?
King Xerxes imposed tribute throughout the empire to its distant shores, and all his acts of power and might, together with a full account of the greatness of Mordecai, whom the king had promoted, are they not written in the book of the annals of the kings of Media and Persia? Mordecai the Jew was second in rank to King Xerxes, preeminent among the Jews, and held in high esteem by his many fellow Jews, because he worked for the good of his people and spoke up for the welfare of all Jews.
Okay, thank you, Jim. So, don't know for sure why this is inserted in here, but King Xerxes imposes a tax, a tribute, a tax. And then it goes in to indicate that all of the king's acts of power and might, as well a full account of the greatness of Mordecai. It says, are they not written in the annuals? And of course, that implies that the book of Esther was probably written after the king's death, because they're referencing that they're in the annals already. Mordecai the Jew, and many times when Mordecai's been referenced, he's been the Jew, as opposed to Mordecai that Jew that Haman had referred to him. It says he was preeminent among the Jews, second in command, very similar to Joseph and the Pharaoh, held in high esteem. He worked for the good of his people. So when the edict had come out to kill all the Jews, he made sure that Esther got to the king and was able to do something to stop the destruction of the Jews. And of course, the last thing it says is he spoke up for the welfare of the Jews. So today, when the Day of Purim, the Feast of Purim is celebrated, it's multiple things. It's certainly the demise of Haman, it's the destruction of the Amalekites, and it's to honor Mordecai as well as Esther for their roles in preserving the Jews as well as destroying the Amalekites. Any last minute comments or questions about the book of Esther?
Chuck, you and I have talked about this before, and I don't know if y'all have heard me say.
Vic, if you'll go ahead and pass, well, Charles is commenting. This is a survey on this class. Go ahead, Charles, I'm sorry.
I just think that this would make a great series for TV. I mean, from the very beginning all through, I mean, it could be a miniseries, it'd be awesome.
Well, it was.
It was?
It was. And Joe and Tom, it's like Esther.
No kidding. There was a movie on Esther. Okay. Well, you know, and you could certainly put it in today with president and vice president and the bickering and the fighting in just about any nation in the country. You're exactly right. Any other questions or comments? Mhm.
I just noticed in chapter 9, verse 27, the Jews took it on themselves to establish the custom that they and their descendants and all who would join them should without fail observe these 2 days every year in the way prescribed law. I
So,
guess we could do that.
yes, we could absolutely join them in the celebration. And of course, we know that there are, the Jews, the Israelites are a nationality, and it's also a religion. And there's many folks that aren't born Jewish or aren't born in Israel that ultimately take on the Jewish celebration. You may remember when we were going through it a couple weeks ago, many of the folks were so afraid of Mordecai and King Xerxes and the fact that the Jews were going to have a chance to defend themselves and kill others, that they decided to become Jews. So they were certainly offered the opportunity to celebrate with them as well. Any other observations or comments? Okay, well, if you're willing to fill out those surveys, I appreciate it. We can just, when you're done filling them out, we can just put them up here. I appreciate so much you continuing with this class. I know Don and Anita would have had a good time being able to teach the whole thing with the relocation. They were unable to do so, so I appreciate you sticking with me for the last several weeks. And with that, we're dismissed. Thank you.